Welcome to The Pursuit, a podcast produced by the Junior Board of the Chicago Midwest Chapter of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, otherwise known as NATAS. We are a group of emerging media professionals seeking insight from leaders in our fields. I'm Anthony Landahl. I'm an aggregated content producer with Nexstar Media in Chicago, and I am your host for this episode. Our guest today is someone who is a stalwart in the history of Chicago media. He retired in 2018 after 40 years of hosting WTTW's weekly show, Chicago Week in Review. He was also a journalist working with multiple papers in Chicago, twice nominated for a Pulitzer among plenty of other honors, and on top of it all, he is a lawyer and a media agent. That's what he continues to do today. There's so much to learn from him, so without further ado, I give you Joel Weisman. Kind of the first official question we like to start off all our podcasts with was, when was the moment you knew you wanted to pursue your career? And you've had a lot of routes you've gone down. So your career in journalism and media, when was the moment you knew you wanted to pursue that career?
I think it was actually in grammar school when I was in about 7th grade, and they started these boy and girl parties, and I was left off a few of the lists, and myself and another classmate decided that we would create a newspaper called the Social News, and we had a popularity ratings section of the newspaper every week, and we would list who's the most popular person and among boys and among girls, and we very cleverly put our names on the top 10 list down at about 9 or 7 or 8, and each week we'd kind of move up a little, and of course as the higher you were on the list, it was a must invite for anybody having a party. And if you didn't make the list at all, you were in really jeopardy of perhaps never showing up at one of these parties or being invited. And so I realized the power of the press, because as I'd go out to recess or we'd play softball, people would come up to me and say, well, how come I'm only number 11? I should really be higher. So I realized the power of the press. And then in high school, if you were a good English student, you were allowed to take accelerated English, which was journalism as a junior. And so I wrote for my high school paper, which was the Sullivan Sentinel. Sullivan High School still exists on the north side of Chicago. And once a month, they had a neighborhood paper, and most Chicago neighborhoods had them, called the Northtown News. And the various high schools would have columns of doings at their school. So one month I got to write strictly Sullivan. Oh. And there was another column called Sensations and so on. And so moving on to college, I pledged a fraternity, and they made you get some activity. And so I joined the Daily Illini with a lot of really turned out to be famous students like Roger Ebert.
Oh, really?
And people like that. And almost most of the people I worked with ended up with professional journalism jobs, most of them in newspapers at the time.
What were the stories that you were kind of attracted to when you were younger? What did you like to write about?
Sports initially. And I got to, while in college, since I was writing for the sports section of the Daily Illini, one of the town paper sports editors asked if I could do some work for him. So I worked for the Champaign News Gazette, as did Ebert. And I also worked for United Press International, UPI, doing the Illinois basketball games when they didn't have a staff person there. So I started in sports, and then wanted to go to law school, and I had been accepted to the University of Illinois, and they offered me a job at the Champaign News Gazette, which is still in existence. But it was an afternoon paper, and they only offered classes in the morning at the law school. So I couldn't put the two together. I couldn't do the classes and have to put out an afternoon paper, which a lot of the work was done in the morning. So I went to Chicago, and I worked for City News Bureau, which was a wire service owned by the papers, the four Chicago papers then, and serviced television and radio stations as well. And was there, I guess, a year or two, and probably a year and a half. And I got married, and then went to work for the Gary Post-Tribune, and then the Chicago American, and was going to law school at the same time in Chicago.
Why did you choose law as your kind of other route besides journalism?
It was actually an economic decision. My family was not wealthy, and in fact, I had to finish college in 3.5 years because I didn't want to spend the money for the last semester. I actually put myself through school, and I would work summers as a vendor at White Sox and Cubs Park, and had other jobs along the way in high school and college. And so I finished in 7 semesters instead of 8. And I thought lawyers did well and made money. That's what my parents told me. And so I pursued that degree. And I didn't get to be the richest guy in the world, but I had a comfortable living. And actually, the journalism was in newspapers because I was a pretty good investigative reporter and a political editor and columnist for the Chicago American, which later became Chicago Today. And that newspaper was owned by the Tribune. And we also had an afternoon paper called the Chicago Daily News, a better paper, I might add, that was owned by the Chicago Sun-Times. It was a 4-paper town, and the competition was fierce. And if you could scoop your competitors, which I was lucky enough to do a lot of times, you could rise up on the newspaper ranks, and I got to be one of the higher paid reporters.
That era you're in, it's the 60s, it's pre-Watergate. What were kind of some of the outstanding characteristics you remember about journalism back then?
Really, Watergate was I would say the pinnacle of the beginning of investigative journalism. We had investigative journalism in Chicago, and incidentally, I joined the Washington Post in the Watergate era. I was a stringer for them while I was working for the Chicago Sun-Times, and also maybe the Chicago Today. I don't remember the exact dates, but anyway, in Chicago we used to have investigative journalism, which papers would team with the Better Government Association, and a lot of the stories were about loafers, city payrollers loafing. And so you'd see a picture in the paper of 10 guys filling a pothole. And then having the mayor comment on why the crew was needed and feather bedded so badly. And sometimes you'd catch a guy sleeping in his truck, while somebody else was unloading the asphalt to make the patch. And it was kind of simplistic stuff. I'm glad to say that early in my career, I was able to use computers for some investigations. Not because I was a computer whiz, but I had an intern at WGN named Peter Treisman, and I was a commentator at WGN in the 70s, and we were able to go through a bunch of city contracts, and if you didn't finish these contracts on time, there were clauses for what were called liquidated damages, a penalty. So it turned, and I was inspired to do the story because I had to race up to see my son, who was in the hospital for a lengthy time. And there was always one of these bridges up over the Chicago River as I was heading to the expressway. And I'd say to myself, when the hell are they going to be done with this? And there'd be signs sometimes saying the project will be completed this day or that day, but they never were. And so we looked it up, and it turned out that they were late, and it turned out that they had liquidated damages, and it turned out, guess what? They never paid them. And guess what? The same contractors got most of the work. And guess what? A lot of these contract companies had city politicians with ownership stakes or relatives involved in the business. So we did stories like that, and then we used computer and data for some other stories. Some stories are just strictly source stories, like we did the Otto Kerner racetrack stock investigation. That was done at the newspapers. It was done at the Chicago American, and that was a source investigative story where the people in the U.S. Attorney's Office tipped us that they were investigating Kerner, who was then governor, for not paying his income taxes. And what Kerner was involved with was they had racetrack stock that they would give out to politicians, and in turn the politicians would make sure these various racing groups would get, and tracks would get, the dates they wanted. And obviously the most coveted dates were in the height of the summertime, but some tracks got them where they were in the winter or really crappy weather where you couldn't get good attendance or good horses. And anyway, Kerner went to jail, and he lied when they investigated him, and he and his buddies were given a racetrack stock with a guaranteed right to sell them back to some people who gave it to them, and that was how they exchanged bribes. And I believe that Kerner and some of his friends, maybe not Kerner himself, but there was a guy named Ted Isaacs and some other people who would, when they got the sale, they would sometimes show the money as capital gains, which is a lower tax rate than regular income. And the IRS said, no, we want you to pay it as regular income, not capital gains, because really it's a bribe. But we're not going to pursue the bribe part. And they wouldn't do it. They were insistent, and eventually one thing led to another, and they unearthed the whole scandal. Meantime, we had several sources in the U.S. Attorney's Office where they would tell us what was going on, and we broke that story.
Did you ever feel like that was the kind of the pinnacle or the prime of your career, was doing stories like these? And
yeah, I liked that the best. And I also thought, the pride of my career, if you want to call it that, we're breaking a lot of political stories, such as, who was going to be slated for certain offices, stories about politicians getting investigated, stories about their family getting government contracts, stories about sometimes bills that were going to be introduced, reforms that were going to be made. I don't know, a lot of political exclusives. And that was how the Post was attracted to me. First I was a stringer for a number of years, and then they hired me to be their Midwest man.
And at this point, you're getting closer to working with WTTW, right?
WTTW came to me because they did some story, and I can't exactly remember what it was. And they came into the Chicago American newsroom and asked about some story that we were doing, and I was on camera. And they couldn't really distinguish themselves at that time for doing anything in news, and they wanted to have a news presence. And there was a man named Bill McCarter who was the general manager, really a great man, and he decided to get into the news business. So they decided to do a program called, it was like the forerunner to Chicago Tonight. And he had produced in Washington the show Washington Week in Review, and he wanted to have that type of show in Chicago. And so he said to me, would you like to do that? And I said, sure, I would, but I love newspapers and I want to still be a newspaper. And he said, well, you can do it part-time. So I said, okay. And we had the show, and then he and John Calloway, who we previously hired, and a producer named Marty Colleen, who was brilliant and had worked for CBS and come to public television. They decided that we all met for breakfast one day, and we talked about having how this show should be done. And McCarter wanted it to be done like Washington Week. Well, the secret with Washington Week was a pretty well-rehearsed show, because on Thursdays, and they had a permanent panel, and on Thursday night, they'd have a conference call, and each permanent panelist would talk about what they were going to talk about the next day. And then each of the other panelists, the other three, would ask, for instance, the White House guy a question about what he had said earlier. So, and then the State Department guy would say, well, the big news here this week was such and such, so you can ask me these questions. And then each of the remaining three would ask one question of him. So you had 4 beat reporters and a moderator, and each of them would ask one question on each subject of each fellow panelist. And I could tell, because of my own experience, that first of all, we didn't have 4 permanent beats in Chicago that would sustain news every single week. Obviously, we had City Hall and politics and maybe education, but on other weeks it might be, labor or breaking news or any number of things. And we couldn't have that structure to show. And I was very, I thought it was kind of fake. I thought in those days television was all fake. It was blow dried, and a lot of these people didn't know as much about reporting as we did, even though, and particularly on the news side. Now, these were mostly newspaper people, so right. I had more respect. But because you'd go out on stories and some of these people would show up to television reporters, and they had no sense of background or history, and there was one guy who would come up to me in Springfield and say, "Hey, can you give me a fill on the new tax bill?" Which had been percolating maybe for 6 months, and he came down there for 2 days to do a story, and I'm supposed to fill him in. So anyway,
when and why did you grow to accept television and as kind of this new
I was
format?
doing it in a way, in a newspaper way, because I just did that show, and then we used to do these election specials, where we'd bring in these candidates, and we we had them from all parties, and we had some Socialist Labor Party guy, who his real job was he was a spotter meaning spot remover at a cleaners. It was kind of funny, some of these people, but they always wanted to make sure they covered everything. So, they were the fair public station.
What I really like about Chicago Week in Review, and I tried to find a few episodes to watch, but it's the format is almost timeless. It worked in the 70s and it worked during the 2010s, I think, as well.
For sure.
And even in this age of shorter attention spans, it's a 24-minute program. It moves quick. You have 4 different journalists. Did you ever think it was going to be timeless, or did you ever think it was going to translate well to new generations?
I didn't think about it too much, but I thought that a lot of it was contingent, and this is certainly no rap on the current host, who I think is doing a good job. Was driven by the moderator, because you were editing on the fly. You could, if something turned out to be not that interesting, you flip to another subject, and that it wasn't life or death news. I don't care what it was. I didn't see too many people dying from some public policy issue, and so I thought you could inject a little sense of humor. And I also thought it was a way to let the public in on some secrets, which a lot of times you couldn't do with another show, because you could editorialize on all these things, in essence, because it wasn't one of those things where you just were tied to the statements of the newsmakers. So we could analyze what they said or what might happen. So it became predictive. It became historical in the short-term sense about how did we arrive at this? Why did this happen? And then it became a little bit of a personality-driven show because some of these guests became personalities, and I could play off of them and so on. So it was a way to mix it up. It was structured, but in a loose way.
You had so many great journalists on, hundreds, maybe even thousands of different guests. What was one common trait you saw among the great journalists?
I think they were educated in the why. By that I mean, why did this happen? And they looked, and they were forward-looking. They were both backward and forward-looking. That how did this happen, and what, by having happened, was going to be the next step. Whereas a lot of other journalists, again, no rap at them, were obsessed with the what.
I guess what's the key to finding your way to focusing on the why?
I think it takes a little reflection. It also takes knowing a little history, because a lot of these things that occur have happened in the past. And like with all the shootings in Chicago, there's going to be a realignment of the police. That happens all the time. When you have a bad summer, or even a terrible weekend, or somebody is. There's numerous examples. If a Democrat unveils something, there's going to be a Republican reaction, and vice versa. But I think part of it is history, and not just of the local thing, but a lot of stuff repeats itself in various venues under various names of people.
You took the question straight out of my mouth. I was going to ask you.
Well, that's because I am a minor in dentistry.
Yeah. I was going to say you have 5 decades and of so much experience in journalism, and I was going to ask, does history actually repeat itself, and how has it repeated itself?
Well, it does in many ways. There's scandal and then reform. There's the fresh face and running for office. There's the usual reactions to tax hikes and will there be a tax hike, and to fairness. There's certain things that you do get unity on that used to be foreign policy, at the federal level. Where politics stops at the shoreline. That doesn't happen as much anymore. And so there are certain processes that repeat.
How did you go about selecting your guests? And also, how did you go about kind of selecting the issues each week?
That was my hardest job. People said, well, it really must be easy because you only show up there for a half hour a week. Mm-hmm. And that part was true. But on Monday, I'd read the Sunday papers and I'd know what was going on, because a lot of politicians would sometimes ask me to go to lunch, or they'd call me and say, what do you think of this or that? And so I had an idea what was going on, and I'd see what was in the Sunday. Say, well, maybe here's something that I could use on the show, and maybe here's something else I could. And then by Tuesday, there's a wholly different news flow. So it became a perpetual a change of topics as the news unfolded that week. And but you could tell that some of these topics were going to have legs for the full week because it was a continuation of some other issue or story, or it was so sensational that we definitely have to cover that. And so I'd give our producer a handful of names that I thought could handle these, but more importantly, I'd give them the subjects that for sure I was going to handle, and they were free to invite the guests that either they knew would be good, or they vetted, or had been on before. And I always tried to have, I could always tell, for instance, by the time I retired, that we needed a political person every week. And since we did sports, which they're not doing anymore. I always wanted to have a sports person, but I thought the public enjoyed not hearing so much about the scores, but about these people talk out of their expertise. So when the sports guy would talk about politics, like Lester Munson would often do, or like Bill Gleason years ago wrote a book about Mayor Daley. He was a sports columnist. People were fascinated by these people, how smart they were, or how biased they were in other areas that they didn't cover.
That's what I also noticed too. Is the journalists were extremely versatile. That I forget who it was, but it was an Associated Press reporter, and he had switched from talking Chicago politics to talking Chicago Bulls. And I thought, it was great because it was kind of the camera veered off from everyone else and kind of did a close up on him. And it kind of became more of a one-on-one, but it was also, there were 4 people on stage and you could almost go into this little corner and have your own segment there. I mean, if you watch CNN or some of these cable shows, they have big 8-person panel of guests and analysts, and it always looks challenging for, just the segment. It might just be a 4-minute segment, but you had to do it for 30 minutes. And you have so many great minds in front of you. How was it to juggle all these opinions and facts being thrown at you?
Well, you have to edit, as I said before, on the fly. You have to decide how deeply you want to let them veer off. And then sometimes it was interesting to draw them in on other subjects, because Marianne Ahern at Channel 5 once was talking about the show, and she said, I'm there to talk about politics, and we're talking about an airline strike, and Weisman asked me, how would you do it if you were a stewardess? How the hell do I know about us? So I'd like to put some of these people on the spot.
And during this entire time, you're practicing law, right? That's kind of that's your side job. Or is that your side job, or is that your day job?
Well, it's kind of my day job for the last several years, actually probably 25 or 30 years. But I was a full-time newspaper person. And I was suspicious about television. I never really wanted, dating back into the 60s and 50s even, I never wanted to cast my full lot with it. And but I had a pretty nice television career, as it turned out. I would when I was with WGN, I would do 4 commentaries a week. I did this for over a decade, and I would take the train downtown to my law office, and I'd read all the papers, and I'd write commentaries, sometimes on the train or immediately when I got to my office, and then they would produce them. And what I do is come in on Mondays and Wednesdays, I think, and I would do one live on Monday, and then record one for Tuesday, and then on Wednesday be live again and record one for Thursday or Friday. And it was, I think I was better because I had so much stuff to do. I didn't get a chance to, put my hand on my chin and think, is this right or that right? Or is there something? It taught you to be a little more decisive. You had to pull the cord on some of these ideas.
You retired from the show in 2018. You did it for 40 years. Was there ever a point where you, prior to that you thought you were going to stop hosting, or that it was starting to be too much?
Yeah, it started to be too much. Actually, about 5 years before that, I really gave it serious thought. It was always just so exhilarating to do that half-hour show each week, because it was, a time to see these folks who had really become sort of friends. Because some of these people have been on for years and years, and you knew about what was going on with their children and their marriages and their jobs and job changes and all that sort of thing. But it was just that half hour was just nothing better you could think of, because you were kind of the boss and you could keep up on everything, on the gossip in the industry, and also stay very well educated, because a lot of the stuff was not put out on the air, but you learned a lot more of what was going on. But it got to be cumbersome, because my 3 children all live out of town. I have 2 sons in California and 1 in Washington, D.C. I had 1 grandchild, and he was starting to grow up, and I wanted to see him. And I was pretty stubborn. I didn't want to miss too many of these shows. And so it was hard to put together a lot of time to be off and spend with the out-of-town family members. Plus, I myself wanted to play golf more in the wintertime, and we have an apartment in Florida. And so, I pondered it a long time and decided if I could get to 40, it was 40 and out.
But you're still not fully retired. You're still an agent.
No, I'm still an agent. I still have the law practice. Thank God I have lots of clients that think I still can do a good job for them. And we have clients across the country as an agent.
Right.
We have them in markets big and small. And over the years, I guess we've had clients in almost every top 50 market. And some of our clients at various times were the highest paid clients at the respective jobs that they do or in the respective markets as they are. And, we've represented a lot of familiar names here in Chicago that you would know, like Allison Rosati and Mark Jean Greco, and just to name a couple, and Chuck Gowdy and Dick Kay, who's now deceased. There's a whole lot of them.
Hey there, you're listening to The Pursuit, the podcast series produced by the Junior Board of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, Chicago Midwest Chapter. My name's John Owens. I'm the president of NATAS Chicago Midwest. We'll get back to this great interview in just a moment. But first, I just wanted to make sure everyone keeps an eye on the NATAS Chicago Midwest website. And we'll have information about the upcoming 63rd Annual Chicago Midwest Emmy Awards. This will take place later in the fall. And we'll also have more information on some of our workshops and special events that we have planned for this season. Our website is at chicagoemmyonline.org. So be on the lookout for some of the great events we have planned for this season. Now, back to the pursuit.
Through the beginning of the practice, how did it start and how did it kind of grow to the point you're at now?
That's a very interesting question I ask myself sometimes. I got my law degree. I was very lucky when I was going to law school and I was working for the American. My city editor was kind of admired the fact that I was going to law school. And when I first started, I wasn't entitled to any vacation. And I came to him and I said, I need a few days off to study for finals in school. And would you please deduct it from my vacation? He says, just take the days. He says, and you'll still have your vacation. And he was really nice about it. And I tried to work hard and earn his trust and confidence. And I was going to school while I was working. And I guess, and then while I was working, people knew I was going to be a lawyer. And when I was one, people would come to me and say, can you help me with this house closing? Can you do this divorce? Or can you look over this document? And I said, I'd tell them, well, yeah, but it has to be on some downtime when I can get away from work. And so I started doing it that way. Well, who were the people who were asking me to do it? It was mostly journalists. And then Dick Kay comes up to me one day and says, he says, I want you to do my contract at Channel 5. And I said, Dick, I've never done one of these things. And he says, well, they've been screwing me for years, and it's about time somebody stood up to them. And I said, well, I've never done it. You probably need a tough agent who's been in business for a long time. He says, look, you're a good reporter. You're going to be a good agent. He says, you're a good lawyer. He said, I put my trust in you, and I bet you'll do it for less money than some of these other guys. I said, sure, because he was a friend. And, one thing leads to another, and then people recommend one another. And so that's how the agent side of it really kind of blossomed. And it was sort of a good time because in those days, there was the mistaken belief that if a person who might be a star reporter at Channel 2 went to Channel 7, that the ratings would go up at Channel 7. Now, one reporter could shift to another station unless they were a superstar. they would almost not have any effect on the ratings. But when the days when you would have this big effect, stations were willing to pay up to get that. And now with anchors, that still works, but not necessarily for reporters. You saw some of the things that happened when Tom Skilling was considering going to the Channel 32. WGN suddenly had to really open their pocketbook. And he, over the years, he became one of the highest, if not probably the highest paid weatherman in the country. And deservedly so. He's terrific. But then when I, opened my law firm, I was doing that full time, even though I was still on television part time. Everything, it was pretty methodical.
Did everyone have agents when you were starting out in the 70s? How did that develop?
National people had agents, and some of the anchor people in Chicago had agents, and many of them were people who were represented people on network news. And there was one or two other lawyers in Chicago who did some of this work. And there weren't a lot of lawyers who did this. And that was a bit of a benefit. Because if you wanted a good agent in Chicago, you didn't have that many places to go. And so a lot of the media companies became more stingy. And people looked for ways to looked at it as an earnings enhancement. And a lot of people wanted to move from lesser markets, or sometimes different environments in other large markets, say to Chicago. So, if somebody in LA wanted to come to Chicago, they might come to me or one or two other people because they knew I had all these Chicago connections. And when you start dealing with people all the time, they know not to bullshit you, and you can get right down to business, and that they're going to get the maximum they can get, as opposed to have some agent who'd never done it before. And some people would say, well, why do I need an agent? My lawyer could do this. Well, your lawyer could do it, but when a well-known agent calls, for instance, they're going to return that call. They're going to return it, because maybe it's a call about somebody that's already represented at that station, B, because they know the agent and they want to make sure that if there are other clients that person has, that they'll think to bring them to that station, and C, they'll answer the phone because they may have a need for something, and they know that we have a great stable of people. So it's kind of a leverage situation. Access and leverage is what they're buying. And there's a lot of movement in this business, as you know, and a lot of clients want to come to Chicago. So they want to come to people who have those connections in Chicago. But at the same time, if they can't get here, we found that if you can't get to Chicago and you're in bumblefuck Georgia, what's the matter if I get you to Atlanta instead? And they're happy about that, even though their ultimate goal was Chicago. So we'll get you to Atlanta this time, and maybe by that time you'll be eligible for Chicago. And things then spread out from there.
One of the things I really admire about you, how you have such a solid philosophy as an agent, but you also have such a solid philosophy as a television host and as a reporter. This kind of jack of all trades type of mentality. When you started out, did you want it to do as much as you could, or was it just about getting work for you?
I think it's competitive. It's just wanting to compete. It's wanting to get invited to the parties in seventh grade, and it's wanting to beat the other Champaign newspaper when I have a story about who's been benched on the basketball team. It's wanting to be first, and it's wanting to get fairness. And I got to tell you, since I'm in the business myself, mm-hmm. When I'm negotiating, in a way, I feel like I'm negotiating for me. Because, I want to redress every wrong that was ever done me for the next guy, through the next guy. And I want to get every last penny that I thought I should have gotten, I'll get for the next client. It's just because I've been there and done it and know how sometimes you're treated unfairly or abused, or maybe treated fairly and not abused, but that they could still make it better for you.
And you've got your due. You've gotten a lot of accomplishments and accolades. You're twice nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, correct?
That's correct.
And what was that reporting for?
That was for the Kerner racetrack stuff.
Okay. And then Chicago Emmy Awards for the television show. And one of my personal favorite honors of yours that I found is that January 19th, 2018 was proclaimed as Joel Weisman Day. That was around your retirement. And it's not an annual holiday that children can take off school or anything like that, but it's a unique honor nonetheless. So when you do look back on some of the accolades and accomplishments that and the wide array of acknowledgments you've gotten, what does that mean to you?
Well, the political ones don't mean that much because they, governors love it. Doesn't cost them anything to proclaim Joel Weisman Day or anybody other's day. That's. I had a stepfather that was a superintendent of schools who never met Ed Burke, and he passed. And one day he got a proclamation saying that it was Robert Bell Day, and it's a way for them to ingratiate themselves to you.
Right.
So those I don't. I'm not as coveted. I don't covet those as much as the other ones. The Emmys count, particularly the earlier Emmys, when the local chapter was basically Chicago only, and so you're competing against well-schooled and experienced colleagues. Now the Emmys have been watered down a little bit because you're competing against markets like Green Bay in the local chapter, and Milwaukee and South Bend and places like that. And also, it's not like one Emmy for a particular category. They'll give out multiple Emmys. So the earlier Emmys that I received, in fact, all the Emmys I received, were singular. It was the only Emmy given in the particular category. So those I covet, definitely. Particularly since I always viewed myself as a newspaper person, not a television person. So those count. I don't know. I think you mentioned some other awards, and the Pulitzers.
Pulitzers, yeah.
Yeah, the Pulitzers are, bittersweet. The nominations. I thought we should have won the one for the Kerner investigation. Isn't it funny? I mean, here we are 40 years later, and I'm still bitter because the paper that won did a story on somebody robbing the coffee can where they throw change and to pay for coffee at I think it was the Springfield, Massachusetts Police Department.
Wow.
And it turned out that some of the people who were robbing the coffee can, were also involved in some other tawdry activity. But I thought, putting a governor in jail was a little more important than that. But, there's politics involved in the Pulitzers, too.
Yeah, right.
Most of the Pulitzers go to the same papers all the time, the Washington Post and the New York Times. And, when I was with the Post, I thought it was great. But, so a paper like the Chicago Today or Chicago American, I don't think ever had a Pulitzer. But nonetheless, I thought we were entitled to it.
Yeah, that bittersweetness kind of goes back to that competitiveness that you have.
Right, exactly. And there were some other things that I thought should have been nominated. There's some from the Sun-Times and other things that I'd worked on. But obviously, I take a lot of pride in those. No question about it.
Was there ever a journalist who you found more competitive than you were, or someone who was maybe more intense?
Very good question. Yeah, there've probably been a few of them.
Anyone come to mind?
Yeah. Unfortunately, he just passed away. It's a guy named Ed Pound. And he worked with me. He was from Alton, Illinois. And that was his first job. And I don't know if you know where Alton is. It's down near St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
And I met him in the press room in Springfield. And ultimately, I helped him get hired at the Chicago American. And we worked on the Kerner story together and some other ones. And then we both worked together at the Chicago Sun-Times. And he went on to work at the Wall Street Journal and I believe USA Today. And he did an amazing number of stories. And he was a very stubborn guy. And his stubbornness sometimes got him into, I don't know, rough confrontations with his bosses, but this guy could find problems everywhere, and he was just dogged. So he'd work 24/7. He'd stay up nights thinking about things. And he had never gotten a college degree. He got married after he was in high school, and he wanted to prove to the world that if he could have gotten a Pulitzer, that would have been his college degree, his PhD, actually. But he won lots of awards, too, and he was extremely dogged. And that's just one that comes to mind. But a lot of my competitors were just that. They were competing, and they were competitive. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the reasons it was so much fun to do it, because you were up against people that you respected.
When you first started out, did you have any inspirations or were you influenced by any particular writer or journalist?
Yes. I used to read James Reston in the New York Times. I thought he was a terrific writer. And he headed, I think, the New York Times bureau at the time. And I have a kind of I don't know what you'd call him. He's a cousin of a cousin, and his name is Ralph G. Martin. And Ralph Martin worked for Stars and Stripes during World War II. And he's a clever guy, and and so every time the GIs would take over another town in Italy or one of the countries that they liberated, he would always be next to the guy who carried the flag. So his picture was in the Stars and Stripes during every liberation. But he was also a very talented journalist, and he ended up working for Newsweek, and he wrote several books, two of which were about Winston Churchill's mother, Jenny. Oh. Jenny Jerome was her name. And he also wrote some books about Kennedy. I think one was called A Hero for Our Time. And he worked for Newsweek magazine, and Newsweek was known for its Periscope column, where they'd give these kind of tips about what's going to happen, and very cleverly done. And so he was a good writer. And so I met him while I was in college, and we talked about journalism a lot. And I stayed in touch with him over the years. And he's really a master of the craft. And so I admired him a lot. And he said, I didn't know whether I should just go to law school or quit and become a journalist. And he said, he says, there's nothing like journalism. He says, you have a box seat to history. He says, no one else can say that except other journalists, because it unfolds a special way for you. And so I saw him later at the 1968 convention, and he brought his son with him, and he was covering the convention. And on, I believe it was the Thursday night before, they gassed all these demonstrators at Lincoln Park. And they told them that they had to clear the park by 11 o'clock, and anybody who didn't, they gassed him. And he and his then 12-year-old kid got gassed. And I said, I sorry you brought your son. He says, no. He says, I think it's important to be one-on-one with your kids. He says, it's totally different going skiing with your kid when he's 25 as opposed to 8, because, he's never going to be 8 again. And he says, when you're in a car with your kid and just you and the kid, and he says, they got to talk to the window or they got to talk to you. And it's just great to have one-on-one relations with them. And I always took that to heart. And I hope it influenced my relationships with my kids.
Yeah,
the three Weisman.
That's what you call them?
Well, they're all boys, yeah.
Oh, it works out perfect. You never took him on assignment, did you?
I did.
Oh, really?
Absolutely did.
Any good stories out of that?
I do. We were just talking about it the other night. My son Scott, who's my oldest son, came with me when I was covering Jimmy Carter for the Post. And I spent a lot of time with Carter in that campaign. And so I took him through a Wisconsin swing, and I think we may have hit part of Minnesota and Indiana. I don't remember exactly. But, and he was at the age, I think he must have been about 9 or 10, maybe 11. The way the thing works is the press would get off at these stops through the steps, back steps of the campaign plane, and then they'd put up the jetway or the formal stairs that they'd wheel up to the plane. We're talking about smaller cities and smaller airports. And then the candidate would come out, and there'd always be a picture in the local paper of the candidate waving with the door of the plane behind him and the stairs in front of him. So we walked, and then the press would often walk around to see what he'd say when he met the local luminaries. And so I walked Scott around to the stairs, the front stairs, and Carter walks down the stairs, and he puts his arm around Scott. And he says, "Come here, Scotty." And Scott says, "Why?" Scott says, "Why are you putting your arm around me?" And he says, "Because maybe your daddy will write something nice about me." And it became very stern. He said, "My dad only writes the truth." It's a true story. And then I had my second son, Mitchell. When I was the Midwest bureau chief for the Post, I did a story in Indianapolis with a governor named Otis Bowen, and I believe he was a physician. And so I had this interview in the governor's office, and my son Mitchell said, I said, "This is my son Mitchell, the governor. Say hello to the governor, Mitchell." And Mitchell says, "Hi, Governor. Where's the washroom?" So it was fun.
You must be a proud father.
Well, I was then. Now it's a little different.
No.
Big kids, big problems.
Yeah.
But no, it was fun. It definitely was fun.
As I want to respect your time, but so I'll give a few wrap-up questions here.
Sure. I hope I haven't rambled too much.
Joel, I wish we could go 2 hours, to be honest. I wish I could pick your mind all day. You've had all this experience, you've had these stories, so you've met these journalists on your show, working on assignment, you've met other journalists. So through the years, how have you defined success?
I guess it's by winning. I've defined it by winning and by the opportunity to kind of be on the inside, and which a lot of people can't do. I mean, a lot of people win at various things, but I thought this was one of the rawest forms of competition people could have. And the reason for that I say that is really a testament to journalism, or journalism as it used to be, is that you were bound not only to win, but to do it correctly. Getting stuff wrong was not really an option that you could repeat very often. So I liked the pressure, I liked the tension, and I liked the fact that and the people you covered were generally interesting people. And you got to see things a lot of times before they happen, or knew about them before they happen. And sometimes you put your 2 cents in, and an idea or something you talked about with somebody would suddenly find its way into law or something. So that was, to me, made it the most interesting profession that you could have. And the law, but you don't know oftentimes when you do a story what the total influence or impact will be on the reader or the viewer. When you're practicing law, it's that one person, and how grateful and sometimes angry or disappointed that one client is. So you get that immediate feedback. Whereas in journalism, you don't always get the immediate feedback. You don't know how it's going to land. what you've done.
We always want to ask our guests for a little piece of advice, a golden rule, let's say, for our audience out there. What would your golden rule be for good television or good reporting?
I'd say ask the extra question. I would say try to frame the story well. They don't have your background when they pick up that story. So it's important to be concise, but at the same time, don't assume that the reader knows everything you know. Part of it's an education or a revelation. And I think there should be some limits. I know this sounds contradictory, but there should be some limits on the time of a television piece, or the length of a newspaper article, because it's a tight wire act to give enough information to actually communicate the idea and give necessary background, or bore the person to death or confuse them to death. So my advice is to put yourself in the viewer or the reader's position and go from there.
It's probably the ultimate irony, but Joel truly is a wise man. There's so many questions I could have asked him about that we just didn't get to. Stories from his time covering Chicago, stories from hosting the show, and on top of it, which I can't get around, is that he also practices law, which I think is just indicative of the fact that it's good to have options. And that's what you should be learning from this podcast. He's a fine example of a great journalist and someone who sets the bar for a top-notch work ethic. To reach a certain level of quality in whatever you do, there needs to be some competitiveness in your blood. If you haven't appreciated an episode of Chicago Week in Review, take a look on WTTW. Go to their website. It's one Google search away. But again, thank you to Joel. I'm glad all of you, the audience, could join us. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about a living legend. So stay tuned for more Pursuit episodes. We have a lot of great and unique voices coming up. This has been The Pursuit, a NATAS Junior Board podcast.